You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Howdy, folks, and welcome back to Modern Musicology. My name is Alan, and joining me today is Rob Levy.
Hey, kids.
And we have a special guest that's going to be joining us for this discussion today. Rob, why don't you do the honors?
Yeah, we are joined tonight by Widgett Walls, the chief bottle washer of needcoffee.com, self-professed Floydian, and author and fellow DJ at Louder Than War Radio.
Yes, until they change the locks.
Surely they wouldn't dare.
Oh, I don't know.
That's okay. I know where the air conditioning ducts are.
Nice. Nice. All right. This week, we are going to be talking about one of the greatest albums ever made. And when I say that, I don't just mean that it's like a great rock album. I mean, this is one of the greatest achievements of recorded music ever. This is a landmark album. It is the 50th anniversary of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. The anniversary actually was earlier this year. It was actually in March, but our March was completely booked with guests that we had on. We've talked about Dark Side a couple of times this year. We talked back in January. We did an episode reviewing the Abbey Road documentary by Mary McCartney. And then in our 1973 episode, we talked a little bit more about it. But I really wanted to devote an entire discussion to, because this is, I mean, as I say, one of the most important recorded albums ever. So we are lucky to be joined by Widgett Walls. Mr. Walls, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your history with Pink Floyd? How did you first discover Pink Floyd, and what was your inroad into that?
My first memory is listening to music. My dad played for me Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, and it left an impression on me. So from there to get to Floyd, it used to be that you had to go in search of music, or you had to have a friend recommend music to you. You didn't have algorithms, and you had to actually go to a store and talk to humans. It was terrifying, but we somehow got through it. And I had a friend of mine in high school hand me a cassette tape with Piper at the Gates of Dawn on one side and Dark Side on the other. So yeah, that was my introduction to Floyd, and it just sort of went from there. And as I discovered their albums, I was just fascinated by the various incarnations of the band and how they reinvented themselves whenever they felt like it, or in some cases, whenever it was necessitated by circumstances. But I found that absolutely fascinating. And it was sort of that was my inroad to Floyd, which was my inroad to lots of other weird, psychedelic, odd music. And I've been in therapy ever since. It was great.
Okay. I'm very interested in this cassette that a friend of yours gave you with Piper on one side and Dark Side on the other. I mean, that is two very different listening experiences.
Yes, it is.
It doesn't sound like the same band in a lot of ways.
No, it doesn't. And I mean, again, I had no idea where they both appeared in their discography. I was just basically handed this. Oh, hey, you might like this, with no other information. And it took me a little while to get into it because I honestly had no idea what I had been handed. I mean, not just because Piper at the Gates of Dawn is much stranger and more, obtuse than Dark Side, but even Dark Side, it took me a few listens to basically get a fingerhold on what was happening in the album. And I've always been drawn to pieces of art that you can dig into, that you can be rewarded for how far you want to examine them. you can listen to Dark Side and it can be just a great rock album or an interesting rock album. But if you want to delve, there's a lot of fascinating technical stuff happening, a lot of fascinating artistic stuff happening. So it's a wealth of stuff that you can just dig into and just keep going for a long time. So I think that's what really got me hooked on Floyd, is that there's a lot going on here, and I was too young to understand most of it because this is high school, 1870s. So that's always impressed me as well, is going, okay, there's a lot going on here and I don't get it, but it's not because it's necessarily hard to get. It's because I'm not ready to get it yet. So I'm going to circle back on this and try it, give it a little time for me to, ferment, and then I'll come back and try it again. And so I was hooked.
So just out of curiosity, which side of that cassette were you drawn to first? Like, which one hooked you more easily?
Oh, Piper.
Yeah.
And the reason being is I listened to a lot of Dr. Demento. And there's stuff on there that I don't know if he ever played Floyd, but there's stuff that could certainly qualify as his jurisdiction. So that was another nice wrinkle to it, is, okay, they're weird and they have a sense of humor, and they're weird and they're also deep, and it's the same band. Okay.
Absolutely. My first exposure was, I was, growing up in the early 70s, and I just started listening to Top 40 radio and heard Money, of course, which was hit number 13 or something on the US charts or something like that. It was if it wasn't a top 10, it was very close to it. And so it was all over the radio. And of course, at the time, I didn't really understand that it was in 7/4 meter. I didn't understand the structure of the song. It was just a thing about cash registers. That's all I knew. And it wasn't until later on that I really started to understand. And it more had to do with a very similar experience to what you had with Floyd, a friend loaning me a couple of Rush albums. And one of those Rush albums was 2112. And that really opened my mind to differences in song structure, in time signatures, in key structures, and all this kind of stuff that really sort of led me back to understanding what Money was all about compositionally, and then more into Floyd. How about you, Rob?
Kind of similar. I was in high school and I was a little hoodlum, well on my way to being a big hoodlum. And I had a English teacher that gave me a stack of cassettes one day. One was Velvet Underground and Nico on one side, and Joy Division Closer on the other. And then he gave me a cassette of Bitches Brew, and then he gave me this. And he said, I want you can listen to the rest of these however you want, but for the Floyd, I want you to listen. And he purposely put each side on the cassette. He's like, I want you to listen to this with headphones, and preferably someplace quiet where you can't be disturbed, because you have to hear it all the way through. And I said, okay. And I just knew at that point, I knew about Pink Floyd a little bit because my brother and my sisters would sort of talk about it passively a little bit growing up. I'd seen the record kind of like around the house. I kind of knew what it was, but I never really dived in. So, 1984 freshman in high school me hears this. And the first thing that leapt in my mind is this is what Sgt. Pepper would sound like on drugs. And then I realized that made no sense. And then I literally just kept listening to it. I was just like, what is this? And I kept trying to dissect it and analyze it and figure out how they did this. And then I was just instantly in love too with the whole concept of it and the themes and different things. And, I came back a couple days later. He's like, oh, did you like it? And I go, is this one of those things that's supposed to stay with me and I'm supposed to figure it out? He goes, yeah, the first time you hear it, it's going to drive you nuts. You're going to love it every other time you listen to it. And it's also just a towering achievement in Western civilization, but most people don't know that yet. I'm like, okay, so that's my introduction to it. And that was my gateway to Floyd, really, because I hadn't heard much besides that. And then, from there, literally that same week, I went to the planetarium here because they had every week laser Pink Floyd. And wow, once I, had the whole prism light with it in like a huge room with a big speakers, that was it. And it was amazing.
Yeah, that whole laser light show thing that happened in the 70s and up through the early 80s is so intrinsically tied with this album.
Yeah.
It's like the way that you have to experience it to get the full thing.
And it's kind of ended up as my go-to record. It's kind of like if I don't know what I want to listen to, I put that on, or if I am trying to put together a radio show and I have no idea what 3 songs I'm going to string together, I just put this on to sort of declutter my brain. I just also love the denseness of it. I've stopped trying to figure out how they made it because that just hurts me trying to think about it. It's one of those few pieces of music that is not necessarily just music, but it's sort of like an experience. If I'm sounding too weirdly neo bizarre, it's an event listening to it, right? I mean, you mentioned 2112 earlier, which I kind of think along the same lines, or Sgt. Pepper. They're like certain albums you listen to, and it's an experience. It's a full immersive experience. You're like, you got to invest in it and go to it, and that's what it is for me.
Yeah, totally. So, Widgett, why don't you tell us a little bit about, this album mainly comes from the brain of Roger Waters. All the musicians in the band contributed to the composition, but the concept was his. Talk a little bit about Roger's progression throughout the band that led up to this point, like some of the themes that he was writing about, maybe some of the way that the band's compositions changed over time. Lay it on us.
Well, I mean, obviously you had with Piper, which we were talking about before, that's when Syd Barrett was still in the band and was ostensibly frontman, and sort of the band was following his drum beat, which is why things were so the way they were. If you want to see more of that, of course, like the Madcap Laughs and the other Barrett stuff, which has its own particular charm. But after he had to leave the band, power vacuum, and Roger, who had been there the longest, sort of stepped into it. As you may have come to see recently, Roger is very opinionated. He has ideas, capital I. And it was only later that David Gilmour, who was the new kid on the block in the band, would sort of try to come up alongside Roger. But yeah, Roger was running the show at this point. And one of the major things about this is one of the themes is obviously dealing with insanity. So that the band was having to process losing Syd Barrett to madness, which they kept on processing because I'm sure that was quite a lot to deal with. But also Roger's own fascinations with like the death of his father and the war, which would come to dominate the Wall and especially Final Cut. So you throw all of this in a gumbo with, and apparently this was Roger's idea, having basically a sound booth with questions on cards that were the spawn of the spoken word bits that pepper the album, which sort of tie it together and comment on the theme as it goes along of the mundane and madness and all of that stuff. So you have that thread running through it, and Roger wrote all the lyrics for this. So yeah, he is the dominant force on this. It's not, later Final Cut, it'll be like Roger Waters is Pink Floyd doing the Final Cut with with David Gilmour and Richard Wright and
exactly.
But yeah, so that's Roger's role in the band at this point. And I think his driving of the project with everyone else throwing in their contributions and helping to warp what he had set up, the framework that he had set up, is part of why it works so well. And you have things that I don't know how much Roger even had to do with Great Gig in the Sky, for example, since that was a Richard Wright composition, no lyrics, and just Claire Torrey singing her head off.
Yeah.
But like most things, where you have a band of different personalities and different strengths of how much gravity the personality has, so to speak, the tension sort of creates a diamond. And that's what Dark Side of the Moon is, I think.
Mm.
And just real quick, Robin, what you said about the density of it,
Yes.
this is a fact that I cannot keep in my brain. It's like me knowing, I know that Faulty Towers is 12 episodes. But I can sit and watch 12 episodes and I will still be amazed that it's 12 episodes. It's like you're telling me for the first time every time because it feels like it's so much more. Like
Yeah.
listening to it again today, I was like, this is less than 43 minutes long.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is less than how is that even possible? Obviously, it must fold time or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Alan, I hope that answers somewhat your
Mhm.
question about Roger and the album.
Yeah, definitely.
You're right too, because every time I listen to it, I keep forgetting the time on it. I'm like, is this longer? I literally every time I listen to it, keep thinking it's longer, and then I'm like, I wish it was longer. But then I reflect and I'm like, it's absolutely perfect. Shut up.
Well, part of that is that, we're so used to albums being long now and have for decades. But at the time, you were limited on an LP to 23 and a half ish minutes per side. So
Yep.
No album was more, unless it was a double album, was more than 45 ish minutes. And it's just what you do with that 45 ish minutes. And my God, they just pack it. Like every second of this album has meaning. So going back to some of the compositional history of the band, I'm kind of interested in the steps that lead directly to Dark Side. And the clearest one, I think, is the previous album, Metal, which side 2, one piece called Echoes, is a clear precursor to what they accomplish on Dark Side. But I'm also curious to know what you think the two soundtrack albums that they did, because the soundtrack albums, sort of like it leads them to think more as a complete concept. They're creating music for a storyline, for a existing piece of art. So I want to know from you, what you think those 3 albums in particular add to the steps that they're taking to get to Dark Side.
That's a fascinating question. I think you're absolutely right in that it got them to think bigger.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you could draw a line directly between the soundtracks, scoring films and the concerts that they would put on. Dark Side is when they started having films behind some of the songs when they would perform it live. And, eventually blowing up into Delicate Sound of Thunder and Pulse, or even The Wall, where there was the spectacle, and they wanted to be as small as possible. They, especially on The Wall, they were like, it's best if you don't even know we're here. In fact, I think at a certain point they were playing behind the wall where you could not see them at all. So I think you're absolutely right. It really changed their mindset of what you could do with the music, both on, in the studio and, live. And I think that's the major thing I would say, along with, I wonder, and I don't know the answer of this, is if you're scoring, the film, it's sort of a concept album in that there's one unifying thing that's the film, and so, how much did that influence them creating a full concept album? I mean, they've done concept sides before, like you said, with Metal and so forth, but they hadn't really committed to the full album yet. In fact, I don't know how many there were. Somebody I saw somewhere, because I tried to look up. I could not find this. I was trying to find a sales chart for what was the most successful selling concept album of all time, and I couldn't find it. I could probably put it together, but who has the time for that anymore?
Right.
Anyway.
And that's an interesting thing too, because then you have to define what a concept album is and what things actually qualify as.
Yes.
Because, people say that Sgt. Pepper is. Some people don't. Some people say that the Ziggy album is. But if it is, it's incredibly loose. So it would be an interesting thing to look into.
But yeah, so I think that's what helped them. I've never really thought of it that way, but I can't, looking at, if you subtract the soundtracks from their discography, what does the band look like? I mean, what do they sound like? And And part of what I found interesting about this process of re-listening to the album, just to refresh my memory for this, is probably the first time I've actually sat down to sort of analyze the experience as I was having it. Because every time I start to analyze the experience of Dark Side of the Moon, I just lose myself in the music, and 10 minutes in, I sort of lose track of time, and then the damn thing's over, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'll try it again next time.
That's interesting that you say that. And part of that is because there, except for there being a side one and a side two, there's no separation. So you don't get that sense of here's a song, here's the next song. Everything just bleeds in together, and it's just one continuous work. So you do lose it. You do lose track of it.
I mean, they even lost track of the tracks because, I mean, what was it? At some point, Breathe and Speak to Me were one track, and now they're two tracks again. And then, so they couldn't even really decide where the tracks were at certain points.
Right.
I do remember in the Abbey Road documentary, they talked about Gilmour and Wright and Waters, not all at once, but in various stages, hanging out where the Beatles were recording Abbey Road, and also staying and watching orchestras record at Abbey Road. And they just kind of became, for about 6 months, studio rats at Abbey Road. And I'm wondering if that process sort of gave them a little more of an underscore of their direction. I also think there is, a certain case of birth by chaos. Their band is thrown into chaos because they don't have Syd Barrett anymore. They can, like Widge said, just think big, right? I think it's, guys sitting in a room going, okay, what do we do? And they're like, we can do whatever we want at this point, and I think it was just right place, right time, and taking the influences around them and also the music they were hearing at the time around them as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because in fact, I just double checked myself in another window that you would think after that experience of seeing the orchestras doing their thing at Abbey Road, you think that would be when Adam Hart Mother would happen. But they experimented with that insane concept. Some would say not successful album. I freaking love it. But yeah, so they were already, I think, dabbling in the toolbox. They were just, trying to teach themselves and trying to learn from others as they went, and obviously picked up a few tips here and there,
Now, if I've got my timeline right, what I'm remembering is that they had a lot of this music already written, or at least the concept of it, and they basically took it on tour. So they worked out a lot of this stuff as they're touring it. So by the time they go into the studio, they know exactly. They've worked out changes to some of the arrangements. They've made changes to some lyrics, and they come into the studio knowing what this is going to be.
Yeah, they've gotten to work it. I think there was a quote, I forget who from the band said it, but it was obviously a fairly recent quote saying, you couldn't do that these days. They'd bootleg you to death. But at the time, we could take it on the road and work it and perfect it.
And when they did their 72 premiere of it for the press, they said, you're not allowed to write about this or talk about it until your deadline. You can't go home to your colleagues and tell them what you did. They had that pretty much under cloak and dagger. And the music press knew what was coming. They knew what was coming, but they took great pains to kind of keep it under wraps until they could sort of finish it and get it out.
Which the press preview wasn't it like a year before the album came out?
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. I can't imagine sitting on that knowledge for a year.
Right.
Why did Widge go crazy? I don't know. He went to some Pink Floyd thing and he came back changed. I don't know.
Yeah, they could have also all been so drugged out they forgot about it too.
Well,
who knows?
It was 72 after all.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's talk about the album itself then. What are some of it's an interesting experience to listen to these tracks as like rock radio plays a song here. It was weird enough to hear Money as a single in 73, but when you hear Us and Them on the radio and it's separate from the overall work, talk about some of the high points of the album for you. What are some of the things that really stand out?
There's a lot. I think for me, the high point is Great Gig in the Sky. It is the best song about death that I've heard, and Claire Torrey was amazing. So I absolutely love that track. The other high point for me was the circular nature of the album. I think that's the first album I encountered that was designed to be I mean, it's a circle because it's a record, obviously, but you know what I'm saying? It comes back in on itself and can start all over again.
Right.
Which is the same thing that they play with in The Wall. So that small little detail I quite enjoyed. And Dick Perry, the saxophone work of Dick Perry, loved that. It's interesting that the Claire Torrey contribution and Dick Perry saxophone, they kind of became staples of Pink Floyd Live, to the point where, at the end they had 3 essentially female backup singers, and they had a saxophone player who was just there throwing in sax wherever they felt like it was appropriate, which turns out is more things than you would think. So yeah, those are some of the high points for me. And I think it's interesting that I was looking at the amount of instrumental time versus songs with lyrics, and it feels like, again, the time dilation weirdness, it feels like there's more instrumental stuff than there actually is, and that's because of the breaks in the songs and, like you said, the way it all bleeds together. So it's a very strange experience to go into, because it's, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's different on the inside listening than it is on the outside looking in. So
one of the highlights for me is On the Run, which is a nearly 4-minute instrumental, which is almost purely electronic. And I think that's a fascinating thing to include on an album at this period, where they're doing this very abstract piece with no traditional instrument, except for, like, there's a hi-hat that runs through it. Other than the hi-hat, there's no traditional instrument on that piece at all. And I'm absolutely fascinated by it.
Well, Alan, real quick, the hi-hat sound was electronic.
That's true. You're right. I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that either until I, recently was, again, interested in, well, how did they do this bit? And how did they do it? And that's when I saw, oh yeah, the hi-hat was a artifact of what we were doing on the, whatever it called, ZRS 35 or whatever it was. They didn't have sexy names for devices back then. It was it was just whatever the model number was. But there was also something about how on that song, I don't think there was a way of, like, saving a program that you wanted to run. So when they wanted to do it live, they had to basically set up the machine again to provide the noise so that they could play in front of it. Crazy stuff.
Wow. If you watch the VH1, the making of documentary, Gilmour kind of shows how he did that synth part. It wasn't a true sequencer. They didn't really have that at the time, so they had to kind of fake a way of creating that sort of like ostinato part that goes through it all. And it's really, really interesting. And that's also where I learned about the electronic hi-hat, which I'd completely forgotten about until you brought it up. I'm glad you did.
Yeah, I think, and this probably already exists, but I would absolutely love a documentary that was nothing but how they had to hack stuff to get it to work.
Right.
Like the Beatles in the studio basically inventing weird ways of slowing down tapes and speeding it back up, and then Floyd without a sequencer. I would love that aspect of it, especially because after all that point, what was it? The Beatles said they had built Sgt. Pepper specifically to not be able to take it on tour because they would not be able to pull it off on the road. So yeah, that always fascinates me. Is we didn't have this thing, so we basically had to rig this Rube Goldberg machine to come in and swoop down and hit these buttons, and it's like, it's just amazing. Had to MacGyver the thing.
Yeah, when I think about the process too, it makes me revisit just how much of a studio genius Alan Parsons is, because we always kind of look at him as this, like, kind of AOR pop radio guy, but in the studio he's a beast. And the way he's doing the double tracking, for me, I always thought was fascinating. That's one of the things. I'm a big fan of Us and Them. Both of these tracks would be hugely appropriated later, most easily by The Orb, a band called The Orb, which is pretty much a contemporary sort of reinvention of Pink Floyd. And also stuff like Osric Tentacles, right? You'd hear some of that kind of stuff in these kinds of songs. You can really tell that when you're listening to, for me, those two tracks, that this is a deviation from what's going on now, and it's going to be the future. People that got it right away, but this record, more than a lot of other records, people got like 20 or 30 years later and co-opted for their sounds and for their who they were. And that is one of the true great things about the record, is that you listen to it and you're like, man, this is miles ahead. And then you're listening to a record, an hour later that was made 2 weeks ago, and you're like, oh, I can hear they're listening to Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, the DNA being passed down through musicians and through albums has always fascinated me. But yeah, you could find Floyd in so many things, but Dark Side especially, because there's so much going on the album within 42 minutes, 50 seconds or whatever it is. There's so much happening that there's so much to draw from. It's like the gift that keeps on giving.
Exactly. It really is. And it's not just that it's the same four musicians who are playing throughout and creating these incredible compositions. There's always something new that startles you, like the clocks that come in at the beginning of time, the electronic piece on the run, and then the saxophone solos and Claire Torrey's vocal in Great Gig. It's always a surprise. And what's interesting, I was watching one of those documentaries recently, and Gilmore said, I really wish that I could have been one of those people that bought the record, came home, put on headphones, and heard it for the very first time. What an experience that must have been. He's like, I didn't get that experience because I was
right
on the original end creating this thing that became this monumental masterpiece. And Gilmore is like, it would have been so much fun to experience this as a complete work for the first time.
Yeah. And unless you were around and old enough to listen to it when it first came out, I think I was maybe a year old. So I wasn't even, I might have heard it, can't remember. But unless you were around to hear it when it first came out, you can't have that pure experience because the DNA of it is in so much stuff.
Yeah, you're right.
I could almost guarantee you've heard some of it adjacent before you actually get to the first listen of Dark Side of the Moon. So yeah. I would be fast. Same thing with Sgt. Pepper. I mean, imagine you haven't been in the wake of Sgt. Pepper and all the people who were influenced after it, and you hear that for the first time, just like with Dark Side. I mean, your brain would melt. Your brain would just melt out your ears.
Yeah, the first time I heard a couple of the Brian Eno records and like the first Love and Rockets album, I was like, okay, this is adjacent to Dark Side of the Moon. And it makes me think of like how it just must have been to hear this or even see it, because the artwork is so fundamentally ingrained in our popular culture right now that it just must have been awesome to experience it like in real time.
I was talking earlier about radio playing individual tracks from this thing. And, at this point, anybody who comes to Dark Side will have heard something from it in isolation. They would have heard Time, or they would have heard Us and Them, or they certainly might have heard Money. So you don't get that experience of hearing the complete work. It's interesting that and I only learned this today, it's interesting that upon release, the album came out in March and Money wasn't released as a single until May. That album existed for 2 full months and sold truckloads and like racked up the platinums in complete isolation. There was no radio presence for it. You weren't spoiling a song from it. And they released Money as a single 2 months later because they're thinking, well, we've sold really well. How do we push it further? We have to release a single. So it had that 2-month period where you buy an album and you hear the album. And, you got to think back to the 60s. The 60s was a very singles driven period. And as you move into the 70s, the music industry, and certainly many of the artists are starting to think in album terms, not in singles terms. And this is one of those first albums that makes you think of the album, not a collection of songs. It's the album. It's a complete work. That's two separate thoughts that I just melded together.
No, that's very good thoughts.
And I think actually Money, most of all, I think you can hear that on its own.
Yes.
And it stands alone pretty well. Us and Them is I mean, if you need a second single, that's the one to go to. It's a very interesting song to release, but yeah, Money is your radio play out of that. And I actually don't think that I heard it on the radio before listening to the album. But then again, I grew up in Alabama, where they sometimes would burn radio stations to the ground, accusing them of witchcraft. So
we have a classic rock station here that Money was pretty much always played, and that's sort of like, for a while, whenever I hear Pink Floyd, that's the first thing my brain would go to. And I think that's what a whole generation of kids, goes to. Is they go to Money or The Wall. And I like the fact that it stands alone, but I also love the way that it fits within the context of the whole record. I think it's beautiful.
And when you do, if that does inspire you to seek out the record and you listen to the whole record, you can just see it slot into place and just go, oh, okay, I got you. I see what you were doing there. So, if that gets you in the door, then, more power to you. And I was thinking about what I was thinking of as barrier to entry, the things that would keep you from getting into the album.
Yeah.
It's so short that it's not, it's not going to suck up your afternoon. I mean, it might because of time dilation and weirdness, but that's, the physicists can talk about that. But it also struck me that listening to it again, the lyrics are very legible. Most of the lyrics, you can easily hear what they're talking about. And that struck me as so important to why it has such staying power, is because they're sort of taking in the whole concept of, wealth and the passage of time and death. They're such big topics. They're big, but they're sort of mundane at the same time. It's something everyone is dealing with, so it's sort of universal. And by making sure that you can actually hear what's going on, which is, sometimes a great concept these days, Christopher Nolan, that basically you can hear the poetry that they're doing, and the poetry is not, T.S. Eliot complex. It's, even if you aren't big into poetry, you're still going to get what's happening there. And I'm fascinated by the fact that because of those voices that Roger Waters strung throughout, I was thinking at first, well, does that really tie it down to, normal people, the proletariat? Because over here, we don't really know accents like they have over there. We not really, not especially British, but there's something, then I was thinking there's something about the accents that were on there that even as an American, you've seen enough movies where you kind of know that's the working class British accent, I think. Thinking about all of that, I was struck by how it sort of reminded me of Everything Everywhere All at Once, because it talks about all of these things that are going to happen. They're inevitable, but towards the end, Roger is saying, it's okay. You're going to go crazy, but it's all right. I'll see you there. We're going to have a party. And then you have that last bit of voice at the end, which says, there's no dark side of the moon, really. As a matter of fact, it's all dark. So maybe we're all already crazy,
Right.
So I think that's being able to tap into that and to tap into what people are going through on a day-to-day basis. And I think I wrote down making the mundane and everyday into epic and universal.
Wow.
So, but that especially struck me listening to it today. And I think that's why, you can hand somebody this today and it still resonates, because it's timeless. You don't care about what are obviously what would be now considered Precambrian electronic equipment. You don't care about any of that. Once you lock into what's happening, you could just go on the ride. And not only is it a great ride, but it's a meaningful ride. And I think that's why what was it? It was in the charts for 15 years
Yeah.
over here until they changed the rules,
Mhm.
We got to
Yeah.
get Dark Side out of here. We got to change these rules. This is embarrassing.
Right. And it did do a
Yeah.
re-entry at some point, because I think the total was 19 years. I think about 15 of that unbroken. It's insane. It's the 4th best-selling album ever.
Mhm.
It spent the longest amount of chart time, period.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
I think several of those sales were me because
Right.
all you had to do is put out, here's the remastered edition. Okay.
Exactly.
Here's it on a
Yep.
gold disc. Okay. I don't even know what that does, but I'll take it.
Here it is in 4K
Right.
on a DVD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I got the immersion box set is sitting over there on the shelf. I'm a sucker for certain Floyd albums. Be like, oh hey, we found I think they've actually tapped all of the outtakes or everything, because they were all on the immersion set. But you could come out with a 5th disc to the immersion set, and I would probably go, okay, oh, it's all of the ambient noise from the studio when nothing was happening. Okay, here's my money.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. The one thing we haven't talked about yet is the album cover. And I'm curious to know if you saw the Hypnosis documentary that came out earlier this year. It ran for like 2 nights in movie theaters, and it should go to streaming at some point. I don't know. I haven't found any information about when it is, but it was a phenomenally good documentary, and of course featured this album cover quite a bit.
Yeah, I did not get a chance to see that, but I really want to.
Oh my
because
gosh. It was amazing.
The artwork is, all of Floyd artwork is kind of astonishing, even as it evolves and gets, stranger and more obtuse and yet clearer at the same time.
Yes.
But no, I thought it was very interesting that you have the artwork, and I don't think originally it said the title of the album
Right.
or the band name on it.
Right.
What was I reading, that basically if you looked at the album label itself on the album, that's where you saw that it was called Dark Side of the Moon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mentioned in Eclipse. And I think there's one thing on there that says produced by Pink Floyd, but again, that thing of we want to disappear behind the art, I thought was a great part of the of what went into the artwork, is that this is what we're putting forward to show what this is, and that's all you get. People love a good mystery, especially when it's psychedelic.
I love the fact that for an album that's as dense and tight and compact, it is completely stripped bare in the aesthetics of it, in terms of the artwork, songwriting credits, everything. It's like you have to actually pay attention to the music because they give you nothing. And that, for the time, is something that just didn't really happen. It was like, here's an album. This is not an album. It's a complete work of art. This is like, a symphony, or it's, an opera or whatever. It's one piece of art. You have to consume it once, and don't worry about any of the other stuff. Just listen to the album.
Yeah, one day there'll be a thing called Wikipedia, and you can look up everything to your heart's content. But for right now, you just have to listen to the album.
Right.
And I think it really made people listen to music differently too, which is probably one of the best gifts of it, because at a time when music was kind of beginning to be sort of that recycled 70s sort of formula that we were getting in a lot of ways in a lot of sort of records, this completely just sort of smashed the playing field. And it's like, okay, you can do whatever you want.
That
right?
is true, because this is the time when a lot of that stuff was really starting to happen, where you're getting Supper's Ready from Genesis, and you're getting 2112 from Rush, and all these bands. Yes is exploring sidelong pieces, and that's kind of one of the things that's just naturally occurring in music at this time, and Pink Floyd is just right there with it. Pink Floyd is the first, I think, complete album, cohesive concept. 2112 is a strong concept, but it's one side, and it'll be a couple of years before we get It's 74 before we get Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which is another complete album and a double album. It's nonsensical,
Yeah.
but it's, a concept that flows throughout the entire work. So it's definitely a product of its time, but at the same time, it's moving forward in that time as well.
I was going to say too, there is an art to knowing when to quit.
Yes.
And this record does that perfectly. It doesn't linger. It doesn't wear out its welcome. It's just
what are you saying about the wall?
That's really amazing.
Okay.
Well, I wasn't gonna. Yeah.
So any last thoughts on it from either of you?
Just you should probably go listen to it again, dear listener.
And again,
go listen to it again.
And the thing is, I intended to listen to it, once or twice before we did this, and it literally consumed my week, which was a very happy trip down my musical discovery lane.
It was a happy trip, all right.
It's nice to sort of, well, not that way, but yes.
We're going to take a very short break here. We're going to throw in an ad for one of our fellow podcasts, and we'll be back in 30 seconds to wrap it up.
Good afternoon.
May we be of assistance, sir?
Yes, I'm looking for a podcast for someone who likes that 1960s headache music.
Don't these podcasters have atrocious taste?
Sir, may I recommend this podcast by Monkeying Around? I guarantee a migraine.
I never heard of monkeying around.
You never heard of Monkeying Around? He's never heard of monkeying around.
What does monkeying around sound like? I'll take it.
He took it?
He took it.
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
All right, we are back. So thank you, Widge, for joining us on this exploration of one of the greatest albums ever recorded. It was such a pleasure to have you with us.
It was great to be here and to talk about such a great album and to just geek out on how amazing it is with people who also think it's amazing. And that's because we're all right, we don't want people to have our opinion for themselves. I think I speak for all three of us when we say, go listen to the album, do the due diligence, and then come to the same conclusion all on your own. That's what we really want you to do.
Right. Well, why don't you again tell us where you can be found on ye old internet if people want to track your lovely voice down and hear more of what you have to say.
Yes. What was it? The Bugle podcast used to say, face for radio and a voice for print. My website is needcoffee.com, and that's need coffee as in I need coffee and lots of it. You can find what's happening there. These days, it's mostly the fact that I'm getting used to the, Rob's been DJing and running radio shows since I think radio was invented. So he's used to this. Meanwhile, I'm trying to, get used to it. So I'm doing a show called Widgett Sonic Emporium Menagerie and Lawnmower Repair. And it's every Saturday night. It's at 5 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. If you're in the UK. They have British summertime or something like that. I don't know, but it's just UK time. It's all the same time. But yeah, if you go to needcoffee.com/emporium, you can find all the archived shows, the show notes, all of my excuses. It's all there. We also created a needcoffee.com listen live /listen live, where you can go to the live stream of whatever Louder Than War has playing at the time. You don't have to listen to just me. They have lots of great stuff on there, including Rob's show Antics. So, but those are the two main things that I'm doing right now, and joining social media platforms since Twitter is crashing and burning.
Right.
I think I'm up to 87. I'm not addicted. I can stop anytime that I want to. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Nice. Rob, lay it on us.
So you can find me on Louder Than War Radio on Mondays, 6 to 8 Greenwich Mean Time, as opposed to Greenwich Happy Time, which is 1 to 3 Eastern, 12 to 2 Central, with Antics. In the famous words of my sister, what the hell is this? And then you can hear me on KDHX on Wednesday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. Central Time, doing my show Juxtaposition. All the shows on KDHX are archived. So if you're out buying groceries in your AMC Pacer or your Matador, or maybe you've got a Ford pickup truck, whatever you're driving around to listen to the radio, you can rest assured, when you get home, you can plug into the computer and listen to an archive stream, because everything is archived for 2 weeks. And then I also am a part of the ongoing chaos and madness that is the Weekend Justice podcast for needcoffee.com.
And if you would happily go to my website, Cosmic Creative, which is kozmiccreative.com, you can see some of the books I've written and published, and you can see some of the podcasts that I do. And I've got new books in the works that hopefully will be out this century. That's all I can promise right at this point. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you will go and listen to Dark Side of the Moon and just throw on some headphones, set 43 minutes aside, lay on the floor, turn off all the lights. Don't do anything but absorb the music. It will reward you. And if you don't mind, hey, how about you drop us a line and let us know what you think of Dark Side, and if you've how well you know it. Have you listened to it a million times? Will this be your first time listening to it? We would love to hear your experience. You can email us at modernmusicology1@gmail.com, or you can drop us a line anywhere you find our episode. We will be back next week. Hope you'll join us then. Everybody take care. Have a great week, and we will see you soon.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.